2021 World News headlines. Saudi de facto ruler approved operation that led to Khashoggi's death. U.S. Biden brings empathy to storm-battered Texas. Security official lays out state's mistakes. U.S. says more than 300 people charged to date over Capitol riots. House Democrats move closer to pushing through Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID plan. White supremacist sentenced to nearly 20 years in plot to bomb Colorado synagogue. Donald Trump's niece blasts his chutzpah toward her fraud lawsuit. Syria condemns cowardly U.S. air strikes on Iran-backed militias. Myanmar envoy appeals to UN to stop coup, more protests planned. Gunmen kidnap 300 schoolgirls in increasingly lawless northwest Nigeria. Blinken says U.S. stands in solidarity with Canada in calling for release of 2 Canadians detained in China. Iran can't act with impunity, Biden says after U.S. air strikes. UN writes experts to issue findings on Navalny case on Monday. Biden on track to apply Trump-era rule targeting Chinese tech supply chain concerns. Saudi de facto ruler approved operation that led to Khashoggi's death. U.S. Washington, Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler approved an operation to capture or kill murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. According to U.S. intelligence released on Friday, as the United States imposed sanctions on some of those involved, but spared the Crown Prince himself in an effort to preserve relations with the kingdom. Khashoggi, a U.S. resident who wrote opinion columns for the Washington Post critical of Crown Prince Mohammed Ben Salmane's policies, was killed and dismembered by a team of operatives linked to the prince in the kingdom's consulate in Istanbul. The Saudi government, which has denied any involvement by the Crown Prince, issued a statement rejecting the U.S. report's findings and repeating its previous statements that Khashoggi's killing was a heinous crime by a rogue group. U.S. President Joe Biden tried to make clear that killings of political opponents were not acceptable to the United States while preserving ties to the 35-year-old Crown Prince, who may rule one of the world's top oil exporters for decades and be an important ally against common foe Iran. In a television interview on Friday, Biden said he told Saudi King Salman that Saudi Arabia has to tackle human rights abuses as a precondition to dealing with the United States. I made it clear to him that the rules are changing and we're going to be announcing significant changes today and on Monday, Biden said on Spanish-language network Univision. Among the punitive steps the United States took on Friday, it imposed a visa ban on some Saudis believed involved in the Khashoggi killing and placed sanctions on others, including a former deputy intelligence chief, that would freeze their U.S. assets and generally bar Americans from dealing with them. U.S. officials also said they were considering canceling arms sales to Saudi Arabia that pose human rights concerns and limiting future sales to defensive weapons, as it reassesses its relationship with the kingdom and its role in the Yemen war. We assess that Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed Ben Salmane approved an operation in Istanbul, Turkey to capture or kill Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence said in the 4-page report. To see the full document, click here. The intelligence agency based its assessment on the Crown Prince's control of decision-making, the direct involvement of one of his key advisors and his own protective detail, and his support for using violent measures to silence dissidents abroad, including Khashoggi, it added. Since 2017, the Crown Prince has had absolute control of the kingdom's security and intelligence organizations, making it highly unlikely that Saudi officials would have carried out an operation of this nature without his authorization, it said. In declassifying the report, Biden reversed his predecessor Donald Trump's refusal to release it in defiance of 2019 law, reflecting a new U.S. willingness to challenge the kingdom on issues from human rights to Yemen. This report has been sitting there. The last administration wouldn't even release it. We immediately, when I got in, filed the report, read it, got it, and released it today. And it is outrageous what happened, Biden said on Univision. However, Biden is treading a fine line to preserve ties with the kingdom as he seeks to revive the 2015 nuclear deal with its regional rival Iran and to address other challenges including fighting Islamist extremism and advancing Arab-Israeli ties. Khashoggi ban. In announcing the decision to bar entry by 76 Saudis under a new policy called the Khashoggi ban, the State Department said it would not tolerate those who threaten or assault activists, dissidents and journalists on behalf of foreign governments. The Treasury Department imposed sanctions on Ahmed Hassan Mohammed al-Asiri, Saudi Arabia's former deputy head of General Intelligence Presidency, and Saudi Arabia's Rapid Intervention Force, RIF, in connection with Khashoggi's murder. The Treasury accused Asiri of being the ringleader of the Khashoggi operation and said several members of the hit squad sent to intercept the journalist were part of the RIF, a subset of the Saudi Royal Guard which answers only to the Crown Prince. The U.S. intelligence report judged that RIF members would not have acted without the Crown Prince's approval. Before the announcements, U.S. officials said the sanctions and visa bans would not target the Crown Prince. What we've done is not to rupture the relationship but to recalibrate to be more in line with our interests and our values, Secretary of State Antony Blinken later told reporters. Charles Freeman, a former U.S. ambassador to Riyadh, said that despite the damning report, the Biden administration will have to deal deftly with the Crown Prince because there is no way around him as the kingdom's chief executive officer. Some of Biden's fellow Democrats demanded he do more to hold the Crown Prince accountable. The Biden administration should explore ways to ensure the repercussions for the brutal murder of Mr. Khashoggi go beyond those who carried it out to the one who ordered it, the Crown Prince himself, said Representative Adam Schiff, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He has blood on his hands and that blood belonged to an American resident and journalist. Biden should not meet or talk to the Crown Prince, known to some in the West as MBS, and should consider sanctions on assets in the Saudi Public Investment Fund he controls that have any link to the crime, Schiff said. Saudi Arabia's 2060 Eurobond rose after the Crown Prince was spared U.S. sanctions, though short-term debt in a basket of Saudi stocks ended lower. Khashoggi, 59, was a Saudi journalist living in self-imposed exile in Virginia. He was lured on October 2, 2018, to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul with a promise of a document that he needed to marry his Turkish fiancée. Operatives linked to MBS killed him there and dismembered his body. His remains have not been found. Riyadh initially issued conflicting stories about his disappearance, but eventually admitted that Khashoggi was killed in what it called a rogue extradition operation gone wrong. 21 men were arrested in the killing and 5 senior officials, including a Syrian senior MBS aide Saud al-Qahtani, were fired. The report noted some of those involved were from the Saudi Center for Studies and Media Affairs, then led by Qahtani, who claimed publicly in mid-2018 that he did not make decisions without the Crown Prince's approval. In January 2019, 11 people were put on trial behind closed doors. 5 were given death sentences, which were commuted to 20 years in prison after they were forgiven by Khashoggi's family, while 3 others were given jail terms. Asiri was acquitted due to insufficient evidence while Qahtani was investigated, but not charged. Biden brings empathy to storm-battered Texas, security official lays out state's mistakes. Houston, U.S. President Joe Biden met with volunteers at a food bank, toured a health center and visited an emergency operations facility on Friday to assess recovery efforts from a severe Texas winter storm while an aide blamed state government for being unprepared. Biden and his wife Jill Biden landed in Houston where he met Republican Governor Greg Abbott and Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner to discuss the recovery from last week's storm, which caused serious damage to homes and businesses, left millions without power or clean water for days, and killed at least 2 dozen. At the Houston Food Bank, the largest in the country serving more than 1.1 million people, Biden saw rows of packaged food, from pasta to applesauce, stacked in a large warehouse and watched conveyors move slowly as volunteers pulled food out of boxes and put them in containers for delivery. He visited an emergency operations center in Harris County, where roughly 50% of the county's 4.9 million residents were without power. As my mother would say to you, you're doing God's work, he told workers there. Biden, a Democrat, has sought to bring consolation and empathy to the hard-hit state, which leans heavily Republican. When he visited a vaccination center, he repeated his message of unity. We're not here as Democrats or Republicans. We're here today as Americans. Biden also said his administration has given out 50 million shots of the vaccine out of the 100 million the White House promised will be delivered in the first 100 days. He said the effort is weeks ahead of schedule. America will be the first in the world to get that done, he said. In 5 weeks, the United States has administered the most shots of any country, Biden said. The United States has the highest COVID-19 death toll at more than 500,000 people and is still recording the most infections and deaths per day, according to Reuters tracking here. Biden also delivered a warning with his message of hope and progress. Cases and hospitalizations could go back up as new variants emerge and it's not the time to relax, he said. Earlier in the day, Biden's Deputy National Security Advisor, Elizabeth Sherwood Randall, laid responsibility on the Texas government for foregoing energy regulation that could have left it better prepared. Texas has chosen not to make the kinds of decisions that would provide for the supplies that you would keep for an emergency, that is, to invest in a kind of resilience that other states which are regulated are required to invest in, she said. They don't have the backup in terms of supply or generation capability that they needed to have in this crisis, she said. For 10 days this month, Texas was hit by an unusually prolonged period of very low temperatures. Electricity consumption surged, while many generating units failed to start up owing to frozen instrumentation. The state's Republican leaders have come under fire for not heeding warnings that the Texas power grid needed significant upgrades to defend against deep freezes. While much of the rest of the United States features electricity systems that are interconnected, allowing power to cross state lines, Texas has long stood out for having its own grid. The disaster has been a test of Biden's pledge to work for all Americans to help unify the country. Abbott initially did not recognize Biden's November election victory over former Republican President Donald Trump. Texas state officials lost a court bid in December to overturn the results, which Trump has falsely claimed were tainted by widespread fraud. Last week, Abbott asked the Federal Emergency Management Agency and Biden to issue a major disaster declaration for all of the state's 254 counties. Biden initially signed off on a declaration for 77 counties, adding 31 more on Monday and signaling he was open to increasing the number. The declaration authorizes FEMA to provide grants for temporary housing and home repairs, low-cost loans to cover uninsured property losses, and other programs to help individuals and business owners. U.S. says more than 300 people charged to date over Capitol riots. Washington, the U.S. Justice Department has charged more than 300 people with taking part in the deadly storming of the Capitol by former President Donald Trump's supporters, and at least 280 have been arrested, Acting Deputy Attorney General John Carlin told reporters on Friday. The investigation into those responsible is moving at a speed and scale that's unprecedented, and rightly so, he said. Those responsible must be held to account, and they will be. His comments came just one day after Capitol Police Acting Chief Yogananda Pittman told lawmakers that Trump supporters had indicated they may wish to blow up the building. Pittman expressed concern extremists could target Congress during an address by President Joe Biden. A senior FBI official, responding to questions about that threat on Friday, said the Bureau is watching very closely for any reaction from individuals that would show either an intent to commit an attack or somebody that has already committed one. House Democrats move closer to pushing through Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID plan. Washington, the House of Representatives on Friday moved toward a late-night vote on President Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus aid bill, with a dispute over a minimum wage increase taking some of the luster from his first major legislative achievement. Democrats who narrowly control the chamber said the package was needed to fight a pandemic that has killed more than 500,000 Americans and thrown millions out of work, while Republicans criticized it as too expensive. The measure would pay for vaccines and medical supplies and send a new round of emergency financial aid to households, small businesses, and state and local governments. With Republicans lining up in opposition, Democrats who hold a 221 to 211 majority have few votes to spare. Democrats aim to pass the package before mid-March, when enhanced unemployment benefits and some other types of aid are due to expire. But their path has been complicated by the Senate's rules expert, who said on Thursday that they cannot include an increase in the minimum wage to $15 per hour in the package. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi predicted the bill will pass Congress with or without the increase, but said Democrats would not give up on the matter. "We will not stop until we very soon pass the $15 minimum wage," she said at a news conference. Republicans who have broadly backed previous COVID spending say another $1.9 trillion is simply too much. The White House and some economists say a big package is needed to revive the world's largest economy. Opinion polls have found broad public support for the package. "The only place this is a partisan issue is here in Washington," said Democratic Representative Jim McGovern, a Democrat, in debate in the House Rules Committee. "We are here because people are hurting and communities are struggling." Republican Representative Tom Cole said bill was bloated with Democratic pet projects unrelated to the coronavirus. "Shouldn't we at least spend down the funds already allocated, and see if new money is actually required?" Cole said. Roughly $1 billion of the $4.1 trillion in coronavirus aid approved last year has yet to be spent, according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a nonpartisan watchdog group. Biden has focused his first weeks in office on tackling the greatest public health crisis in a century, which has upended most aspects of American life. Pelosi is counting on nearly all of her rank and file to get the bill passed before sending it to a 50-50 Senate where Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris holds the tie-breaking vote. House bill includes $15 wage. The House bill would raise the national hourly minimum wage for the first time since 2009 to $15 from $7.25. The increase is a top priority for progressive Democrats. That is unlikely to win approval in the Senate. The chamber's parliamentarian on Thursday ruled that doing so would violate rules Democrats are using to pass the sweeping package with just a simple majority of 50 senators plus Harris, rather than the 60 needed to advance most legislation in the 100-seat chamber. At least 2 Senate Democrats oppose the $15 hourly figure, along with most Republicans. Some are floating a smaller increase in the range of $10 to $12 per hour. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer might add a provision that would penalize large corporations that do not pay their workers a $15 minimum wage, a Senate Democratic aide said. Among the big-ticket items in the bill are $1,400 direct payments to individuals, a $400 per week federal unemployment benefit through August 29, and help for those having difficulties paying their rent and home mortgages during the pandemic. An array of business interests also have weighed in behind Biden's America Rescue Plan Act, as the bill is called. Efforts to craft a bipartisan coronavirus aid bill fizzled early on, shortly after Biden was sworn in as president on January 20, following a series of bipartisan bills enacted in 2020. White supremacists sentenced to nearly 20 years in plot to bomb Colorado synagogue. Denver, an avowed white supremacist, was sentenced on Friday to 19.5 years in prison after pleading guilty months ago to a federal hate crimes case stemming from a botched plot to bomb a historic Colorado synagogue in 2019. Richard Holzer, 28, appeared in a federal courtroom in Denver for a sentencing that capped an undercover FBI investigation of a plan to blow up Temple Emmanuel in Pueblo, Colorado, the second oldest synagogue in the state. Although the plot was thwarted, U.S. District Judge Raymond Moore said Holzer had sought to terrorize the Jewish community of Pueblo, a city of 112,000 residents about 100 miles south of Denver. It is one of the most vulgar, evil crimes that can be committed against an entire group of people, Moore said while imposing the sentence sought by prosecutors. Holzer declined to speak at the hearing. The defendant pleaded guilty in October to 1 count of trying to obstruct religious services by force, and 1 count of attempting to destroy a building used in interstate commerce, according to his plea agreement. Holzer, who lived in Pueblo, was arrested in November 2019 following an undercover sting by federal agents tracking his social media postings in which he professed a hatred of Jews, according to an FBI arrest warrant affidavit. Posing as fellow racists, undercover agents reached out to Holzer and later met with him as he broached the idea of blowing up the synagogue, the affidavit said. Ultimately, the agents provided him with inert pipe bombs and sticks of dynamite before arresting him, court documents showed. The judge rejected arguments by defense lawyers that Holzer has renounced his racist views, noting that since his arrest he has reached out to other white supremacists and continued to invoke Nazi imagery. The notion that he's turned some corner is fantasy, Moore said. Donald Trump's niece blasts his chutzpah toward her fraud lawsuit. New York. Donald Trump's niece accused him on Friday of trying to dodge accountability for defrauding her out of a multi-million-dollar inheritance by claiming she took too long to sue. Lawyers for Mary Trump made the accusation in a New York state court in Manhattan, where the 55-year-old psychologist is suing the former president, his sister Marianne Trump Barry, and his late brother Robert's estate. The offensiveness of defendants' past conduct, stealing tens of millions of dollars from their own niece, is perhaps surpassed only by the chutzpah of their current arguments for dismissal, the lawyers wrote. A lawyer for Donald Trump and Robert's estate could not immediately be reached outside business hours. Barry's lawyer declined to comment. The case's origins are in the 1981 death of Mary's father, Fred Trump Jr., the older brother of Donald Trump, who left the then 16-year-old Mary a profitable real estate portfolio. Mary Trump said her aunt and uncles were supposed to look after her interests but instead siphoned money away, and finally squeezed her out of the family fortune in a 2001 settlement related to the estate of Fred Trump Sr., who died in 1999. She sued in September, just under 2 years after she claimed to learn what they did through a New York Times investigation into Donald Trump's finances. Reasonable diligence would not have uncovered the fraud more than a decade earlier, as the defendants contended, her lawyers wrote. Mary Trump's best-selling Tell All Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man detailed some of her allegations. Donald Trump's lawyers have accused Mary Trump of trying to cash in on the family name and consume him with lawsuits. The former president's legal challenges include a criminal probe by Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance into possible fraud, a civil probe by New York Attorney General Letitia James, and defamation lawsuits by 2 women, E. Jean Carroll and Summer Ziervos, who accused him of sexual misconduct. Gymnastics. U.S. governing body shocked over death of former coach. USA Gymnastics has expressed shock at the news that former coach John Geddert died by suicide on Thursday, aged 63, following charges of human trafficking and sexual assault. Geddert, who had ties to disgraced team Dr. Larry Nassar, was charged with 20 counts of human trafficking, 1 count of first-degree sexual assault, 1 count of second-degree sexual assault, criminal enterprise and lying to a police officer, according to court documents filed in Eaton County, Michigan. We had hoped that news of the criminal charges being brought against John Geddert would lead to justice through the legal process, the sport's U.S. governing body said in a statement on Friday. With the news of his death by suicide, we share the feelings of shock, and our thoughts are with the gymnastics community as they grapple with the complex emotions of this week's events. Geddert was coach of the women's team known as the Fierce Five that won gold at the 2012 Olympics and the former owner of the Lansing area Twistars USA Gymnastics Club for elite athletes where Nasser treated gymnasts. The charges against Geddert reignited outrage over the abuse scandal that ripped through the crown jewel of U.S. Olympic sport, with Rachel Denhollander, a former gymnast and the first to come forward with abuse allegations against Nasser, among those calling for USA Gymnastics decertification. Geddert was suspended by USA Gymnastics in January 2018. Former USA Gymnastics Dr. Nasser has been given 2 prison sentences in Michigan of 40 to 125 years and 40 to 175 years for molesting young female gymnasts. He is also serving a 60-year federal term for child pornography convictions. Syria condemns cowardly U.S. air strikes on Iran-backed militias. Beirut, Syria said U.S. air strikes against Iranian-backed militias in the east of the country on Friday were a cowardly act and urged President Joe Biden not to follow the law of the jungle. An Iraqi militia official close to Iran said the strikes killed 1 fighter and wounded 4. U.S. officials said they were limited in scope to show Biden's administration will act firmly while trying to avoid a big regional escalation. Washington and Tehran are seeking maximum leverage in attempts to save Iran's nuclear deal reached with world powers in 2015 but abandoned in 2018 by then-President Donald Trump, after which regional tensions soared and fears of full-scale conflict grew. Syria condemns in the strongest terms the cowardly U.S. attack on areas in Deir al-Zor near the Syrian-Iraqi border, the Syrian Foreign Ministry said in a statement. The Biden administration is legitimacy, not to the law of the jungle as did the previous administration. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh condemned the U.S. strikes, calling them illegal aggression and a violation of human rights and international law. You can't act with impunity. Be careful, Biden told reporters in Texas when asked what message he was sending Iran with the strikes. The air strikes, early on Friday local time, targeted militia sites on the Syrian side of the Iraqi-Syrian frontier, where groups backed by Iran control an important crossing for weapons, personnel and goods. Western officials and some Iraqi officials accuse Iranian-backed groups of involvement in deadly rocket attacks on U.S. sites and personnel in Iraq over the last month. Russia, an ally of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, also criticized the U.S. strikes and called for unconditional respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki said the airstrikes in Syria were meant to send the message that Biden will act to protect Americans. Future U.S. actions in the region will be deliberative and will aim to de-escalate tensions in Syria, Psaki said. Attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq. The Iraqi militia official close to Iran said the strikes targeted positions of the Kataib Hezbollah, KH, paramilitary group along the border. KH later confirmed the death of one of its fighters and identified him as Syed Rahi Salam Zaid al-Sharifi. The American enemy persists in its criminality and kills the protectors of the nation and the honorable people of the country, not deterred from shedding innocent blood as long as the wages of murder are received from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, a KH statement said. Local sources and a medical source in eastern Syria told Reuters that at least 17 people had been killed, but gave no further details. That toll could not be confirmed. The Pentagon said it had preliminary information about casualties, but did not provide any details. In recent attacks, a non-American contractor was killed at a U.S. military base at Erbil International Airport in Kurdish-run northern Iraq on February 15 and, in the days that followed, rockets were fired at a base hosting U.S. forces and near the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Biden's decision to strike only in Syria and not in Iraq gives Iraq's government breathing room as it investigates the Erbil attack, which also wounded Americans. Kataib Hezbollah has denied involvement in recent attacks against U.S. interests. Iran denies involvement in attacks on U.S. sites. Several attacks, including the one at Erbil Airport, have been claimed by little-known groups which some Iraqi and Western officials say are a front for established Iranian-backed groups such as Kataib Hezbollah. Limited response. U.S. lawmakers from both political parties welcomed the strikes, but a number of Democrats questioned the legal justification under which they were carried out and the continuation of military operations in the Middle East. I am very concerned that last night's strike by U.S. forces in Syria puts our country on the path of continuing the forever war instead of ending it, said Senator Bernie Sanders, an independent who caucuses with Democrats. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said the U.S. strikes totally destroyed 9 facilities and partially destroyed 2 facilities at a border control point used by a number of Iranian-backed militant groups, including Kataib Hezbollah and Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada. A U.S. official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said the decision to carry out the strikes was meant to signal that, while the United States wanted to punish the militias, it did not want the situation to spiral into a bigger conflict. The Iraqi military issued a statement saying it had not exchanged information with the United States over the targeting of locations in Syria, and that cooperation with the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq was limited to fighting Islamic State. Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, said Iraq was able to help the United States determine who was responsible for the recent attacks in Iraq, but Baghdad did not assist in the targeting process in Syria. Iraq's foreign minister will visit Iran on Saturday to discuss the regional situation, including ways to avoid tension and escalation, Iraq's foreign ministry said late on Friday. It was not clear how or whether the U.S. strikes might affect efforts to coax Iran back into negotiations about both sides resuming compliance with the 2015 nuclear deal. Myanmar envoy appeals to UN to stop coup, more protests planned. Myanmar's UN envoy urged the United Nations to use any means necessary to stop a military coup there, making a surprise appeal on behalf of the ousted government as police cracked down on anti-junta protesters. The Southeast Asian country has been in crisis since the army seized power on February 1 and detained elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi and much of her party leadership, alleging fraud in a November election her party had won. The coup has brought hundreds of thousands of protesters to Myanmar's streets and drawn condemnation from Western countries, with some imposing limited sanctions. More protests were planned for Saturday, activists said, and police were out in force in parts of the main city of Yangon. Myanmar's ambassador Cho Mo-tun told the UN General Assembly he was speaking on behalf of Suu Kyi's government and appealed to the body to use any means necessary to take action against the Myanmar military and to provide safety and security for the people. We need further strongest possible action from the international community to immediately end the military coup, to stop oppressing the innocent people, and to restore the democracy, he told the 193-member UN General Assembly, receiving applause as he finished. Cho Mo-tun appeared emotional as he read the statement on behalf of a group of elected politicians that he said represented the legitimate government. Delivering his final words in Burmese, the career diplomat raised the three-finger salute of pro-democracy protesters and announced our cause will prevail. Reuters was not immediately able to contact the army for comment. Opponents of the coup hailed Cho Mo-tun as a hero and flooded social media with messages of thanks. The people will win and the power-obsessed junta will fall, one protest leader, A. Thinzermong, wrote on Facebook. UN Special Envoy on Myanmar Christine Schroner-Bergener pushed the United Nations for a collective clear signal in support of democracy and told the General Assembly no country should recognize or legitimize the junta. China's envoy did not criticize the coup and said the situation was Myanmar's internal affairs, saying it supported diplomacy by Southeast Asian countries which protesters fear could give credibility to the ruling generals. Singapore said violence against unarmed civilians was inexcusable. Suu Kyi's whereabouts uncertain. Uncertainty grew over Suu Kyi's whereabouts on Friday, as the independent Myanmar Now website quoted officials of her National League for Democracy, NLD, party as saying she had been moved this week from house arrest to an undisclosed location. One lawyer acting for her, Kin Mong Za, told Reuters he had heard the same from NLD officials but could not confirm it. Authorities did not respond to a request for comment. The lawyer said he had been given no access to Suu Kyi ahead of her next hearing on Monday, adding, "I'm concerned that there will be a loss of rights to access to justice and access to legal counsel." Protesters have taken to the streets daily for over 3 weeks demanding the release of Suu Kyi, 75, and recognition of the result of last year's election. In Yangon, riot police fired rubber bullets, stun grenades and shots into the air on Friday to send protesters scattering. At least one person was wounded there, witness said. Several people were also hurt by police in the second city of Mandalay, media said. Police also broke up protests in Naypyidaw and other towns, witnesses said. Military Chief General Min Aung Hlaing says authorities were using minimal force. Nevertheless, at least 3 protesters have died. The army says a policeman was also killed. At least 771 people are under detention or have outstanding charges that have been laid against them since the coup, according to Myanmar's Assistance Association for Political Prisoners. Suu Kyi, the daughter of Myanmar's independence hero, spent nearly 15 years under house arrest under previous juntas. She faces charges of illegally importing 6 walkie-talkie radios and of violating a natural disaster law by breaching coronavirus protocols. The army has promised an election, but has not given a date. It has imposed a 1-year state of emergency. The question of an election is at the center of a diplomatic effort by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, of which Myanmar is a member. Indonesia has taken the lead, but coup opponents fear the efforts could legitimize the junta. ASEAN foreign ministers are planning to hold a meeting on Myanmar soon, regional diplomats said. Gunmen kidnapped 300 schoolgirls in increasingly lawless northwest Nigeria. Kano, Nigeria. An operation to rescue more than 300 girls kidnapped in Nigeria had failed to pinpoint their location by late on Friday, almost 24 hours after gunmen seized them in a raid on their school. The raid in Zamfara state, where the governor ordered all boarding schools to close immediately, was the second such kidnapping in little over a week in the country's northwest, a region increasingly targeted by militants and criminal gangs. Zamfara police said they had begun search and rescue operations with the army to find the bandits who took the 317 girls from the government girls' science secondary school in the town of Jangam. There's information that they were moved to a neighboring forest, and we are tracking and exercising caution, Zamfara Police Commissioner Abatu Yaro told a news conference. All the abductees remained at large, but the parent of one of them, Mohammed Usman Jangab, said 7 of their schoolmates had resurfaced after escaping the raiders by hiding in gutters. The assailants stormed in at around 1 a.m. firing sporadically, said Zamfara's Information Commissioner, Suleiman Tanau Anka. Information available to me said they came with vehicles and moved the students. They also moved some on foot, he told Reuters. By late Friday, there had been no claim of responsibility for the raid. School kidnappings were first carried out by jihadist groups Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa Province, but the tactic has now been adopted by other militants whose agenda is unclear. They have become endemic around the increasingly lawless north, to the anguish of families and frustration of Nigeria's government and armed forces. Friday's was the third such incident since December. The rise in abductions is fueled in part by sizable government payoffs in exchange for child hostages, catalyzing a broader breakdown of security in the north, officials have said, speaking on condition of anonymity. The government denies making such payouts, and President Muhammadu Buhari reiterated on Friday that it will not succumb to blackmail. In a statement issued late on Friday, he also appealed to state administrations not to reward bandits with money or vehicles. Rage and frustration. Jangam town seethed with anger over the abduction, said a government official who was part of the delegation to the community. Young men hurled rocks at journalists driving through the town, injuring a cameraman, the official said, speaking on condition of anonymity. People mobilized to block security operatives, journalists and government officials from getting access to the main town, he said. Parents also had no faith in authorities to return their kidnapped girls, said Mohammed Usman Jangab told Reuters by phone. We are going to rescue our children since the government isn't ready to give them protection, he said. All of us that have had our children abducted have agreed to follow them into the forest. We will not listen to anyone now until we rescue our children. Military shakeup. Buhari replaced his long-standing military chiefs this month amid the worsening violence. Last week, unidentified gunmen kidnapped 42 people including 27 students, and killed 1 pupil in an overnight attack on a boarding school in the north-central state of Niger. The hostages are yet to be released. In December, dozens of gunmen abducted 344 schoolboys in northwest Katsina state. They were freed after 6 days, but the government denied paying a ransom. Islamic State's West Africa branch in 2018 kidnapped more than 100 schoolgirls in northeast Nigeria, all but one of whom, the only Christian, were released. A ransom was paid, according to the United Nations. Perhaps the most notorious kidnapping in recent years was when Boko Haram militants abducted 276 schoolgirls from Chibok in Borno State in April 2014. The incident drew widespread global attention, with then U.S. First Lady Michelle Obama among the prominent figures calling for their return. Many have been found or rescued by the army, or freed years later after negotiations between the government and Boko Haram, according to sources, but 100 are still missing. Ikemzadeh Fyong, head of research at Lagos-based risk consultancy SBM Intelligence, said many northern governors were keen to pay to avoid protracted hostage situations attracting international outrage, which in turn gave an incentive for more abductions. When you have these mass abductions now and you see victims are released relatively quickly, unlike Chibok, the one thing that has changed is money, Fyong said. Blinken says U.S. stands in solidarity with Canada in calling for release of 2 Canadians detained in China. Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Friday that the United States stands in absolute solidarity with Canada in insisting on the immediate and unconditional release of 2 Canadian citizens detained in China. Businessman Michael Spavor, who worked with North Korea, and former diplomat Michael Kovrig were detained separately in 2018, shortly after Canada arrested Huawei Technologies Company Limited Chief Financial Officer Meng Wanzhou. Iran can't act with impunity, Biden says after U.S. airstrikes. Washington President Joe Biden said Iran cannot act with impunity and warned Iran to be careful when asked what message he was sending the country with the U.S. airstrikes in Syria. You can't act with impunity. Be careful, Biden told reporters while traveling to survey the damage from a severe winter storm in Texas. The United States carried out airstrikes authorized by Biden against facilities belonging to Iranian-backed militia in eastern Syria on Thursday, in response to rocket attacks against U.S. targets in Iraq. UN writes experts to issue findings on Navalny case on Monday. Geneva, United Nations human rights investigators will issue their findings on the case of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny on Monday, a UN statement said on Friday. The opposition politician was arrested in Moscow in January upon returning from Germany following treatment for poisoning with what many Western countries say was a military-grade nerve agent. Agnes Callamard, UN expert on killings, and Irene Khan, UN expert on freedom of opinion and expression, will issue their findings on their investigation at a Geneva press conference on Monday, 1500 GMT, the UN said in a statement revealing the investigation. Biden on track to apply Trump-era rule targeting Chinese tech supply chain concerns. Washington, the Biden administration plans to allow a Trump-era rule targeting Chinese technology firms deemed to pose a threat to the United States to go into effect despite objections from U.S. businesses, the U.S. Commerce Department said on Friday. The department issued an interim final rule in the final days of the Trump administration aimed at addressing information and communications technology supply chain concerns, and said it would become effective after a 60-day period of public comment. On Friday, a Commerce spokeswoman said in a statement the department would continue to accept public comment on the rule until March 22, when it would go into effect. Trustworthy information and communications technology and services are essential to our national and economic security and remains a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration, the statement said. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and groups representing major industries raised concerns in a letter to the Commerce Department in January that the interim rule gave it nearly unlimited authority to intervene in virtually any commercial transaction between U.S. companies and their foreign counterparts that involves technology, with little to no due process, accountability, transparency, or coordination with other government programs. Business Roundtable, a group representing major U.S. chief executives, said earlier the proposal is unworkable for U.S. businesses in its current form. The Wall Street Journal first reported the Biden administration's plans. As the Commerce Department is still accepting public comments, it may still revise the rule based on objections from businesses and others. Don't forget to comment below with your common sense and subscribe to your podcast. This helps bring the podcast to life and grow it. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We can't wait to continue this adventure with you. Support us on PayPal. Thank you very much and enjoy listening.